Hi, I'm Aaron Lopresti. I've been a comic book artist, commercial illustrator, and writer for over 25 years, and this is my YouTube channel. Thanks for joining me. Now, you may have noticed that the name of this show is actually Talking Comics and Art. Well, today we're not going to do a tutorial. Today we are going to talk about comics. Specifically, we're going to talk about the 4 comics I never thought I would own. Well, I've got them, and we're going to take an in-depth look at all of them. All right, it's with this Overstreet price guide from 1976 that my story begins. I discovered this in a bookstore in a mall when I was 12 years old. It was the first time I'd ever seen one. It was then that I realized for the first time that the comic books I'd been buying for the last 2 to 3 years might actually be worth something someday. But the greater thing about the price guide was, in the front and back, they would have photo galleries of older classic comics from, the 40s, the 50s, the 60s. And they were all of books that, were, even at the time in 1976, I looked at and said, these are so expensive, I'll never be able to get one of these ever in my life. And there were 3 or 4 that really stuck out to me that I would say, man, I would love to have that book. But I never dreamt that I would ever be able to get one. Well, I got 4 of them on my list of books that I never thought I would own. Books that I saw in the photo gallery of this price guide and ones that followed years later. So let's take a look at those 4 books, why they're significant to me and why I think they're significant just as collectibles. Number 1 on my hit list was National Comics 26. Now I saw a picture of this book, I think it was in the 77 price guide, the year after the one I just showed you. And I saw that and I thought, oh my gosh, how iconic is that? A World War II comic, Uncle Sam rolling up his sleeves, ready to fight. And I looked at that book and I thought, from 1942, and I thought, how would I ever find this book? How would I ever get it? But I would dream about owning that book someday. And it became my first quest when I became an adult and started really looking at comics, and older books that were more expensive started to become a possibility that I might be able to get. Now, I searched for this book actively searched from probably when I was about 25 or 26 when I went to my first San Diego Comic-Con till I was into my 40s. And I've seen 3 copies in my entire life, and that was actively looking for it. One was the Mile High copy, which was it's either a 9.4 or a 9.6, and was always out of my price range. But I did see it. And that was the only one I saw floating around for years. Well, one day about 13 or 14 years ago, one of these showed up on eBay. And I didn't even care what condition it was in. I was like, I got to have this, right? So I bid on it, and I think they were asking $150 for it. I thought, I'm getting this. I don't care what it goes for. So I bid up on it to $150. Well, before that auction was over, I'm not kidding, 2 days later, Mile High Comics, Motor City Comics, put up a copy as well. But their copy, the one I own here, was much nicer than the one I was bidding on. Well, now, for the first time in like 20 years, I'd seen 2 copies in 2 days. And I had to have the nicer copy, right? But I'd already bid on the lesser copy. So I was like, well, I don't care. If I get stuck with both of them, I get stuck with both of them. And I did. I paid $350 for this one after I negotiated, or it might have been $300 after I negotiated a deal with Motor City because I happened to know those guys. And they also ended up buying the other one for $150. So out of the 3 copies I'd ever seen in my life, I ended up with 2 of them. I later traded the less conditioned one for another book, but I've kept to this one. And this is probably the one book that if I sold my entire collection, I would never sell. Okay, so why is it significant beyond, just that it was a book that attracted my attention as a kid? The cover art here is by Reed Crandall, who, in my opinion, along with Mac Rayboy and C.C. Beck, and of course Frazetta, were like head and shoulders above everybody else in terms of draftsmanship and drawing ability in the Golden Age. There was very few guys that were really, really skilled illustrators working in comics back then, and he was one of them. Reed Crandall was just fantastic. And on the inside of this book, he also did the story in there, and it also has Uncle Sam fighting Hitler. So you have this sort of great propaganda World War II story in this book, drawn by Reed Crandall, with a fantastic cover by Reed Crandall. The book is probably about a 6.0. It was sold to me as a fine condition, and it's in really nice shape, but you can see along the edges, there's the brown along the edges here, and on the other side, it has some foxing on it. So I don't know exactly how it would grade out if I got it slabbed, but I don't think it's quite high enough grade that I would, waste the time getting it slabbed. But I'm afraid to open it up and look at it. I used to look at it several years ago, but now I've kind of sealed it up and said no. But anyway, that is number 1 on my list of the 4 comics I never thought I would own. And I'll tell you something else. I have never seen another copy of this since I bought that. So 3 copies in 30 years is what I've seen of this book. I'm sure they're out there, but they're not on the market very often. Okay, the second book on my hit list is The Incredible Hulk number 6. This is from 1962. Now, this series lasted only 6 issues. This is the initial run of the Hulk. So apparently sales weren't very good. But the interesting thing about this series is, although it was Kirby, of course, who co-created it with Stan Lee and did the first 5 issues, this 6th issue was drawn by Steve Ditko, and so is the cover. Now, I remember seeing this cover in one of the photo galleries in the back of one of these Overstreet price guides as a kid. And I'm looking at that going, that is the funkiest looking Hulk I've ever seen in my life. He had the tiny little feet, as you can see down there at the bottom. And it was just really odd looking, but something sort of appealing about it because of its uniqueness and how Ditko drew the character. I mean, he's the last guy in the world you would think you'd pick to draw a Hulk comic. Although he did show up in Spider-Man 14 when Ditko was drawing Amazing Spider-Man. But it was just incredibly odd artistic choice. But because it had such a unique look to it, it really appealed to me as a kid. And I thought, and it looked really old. There's something about that comic book. You just look at it and go, man, that looks old. That looks cool. I want to have an old comic like that with the Hulk in it. Well, this wasn't a particularly expensive book, at least in the grade I have it. This is a 6.0. But it's still expensive enough that, every time you see one, you think, God, do I really want to lay down $500 or $600 for this book? And my answer was generally no. So I kept passing on it when I had opportunities to get it. The other thing about this book is it's really difficult to find in high grade. All these Hulks are, because anything really prior to 1965 tends to be harder to find in high grade. And these early Marvel books like this, they were coming off the heels of doing all those Kirby monster books before they got into the superheroes. And this Hulk was sort of a transitional book. The FF came out in 1961, but I believe the Hulk was the second book that they released. And it just, like I said, the sales weren't great on it, so there's not a ton of them floating around to begin with. And it's a really older book, again, going back to 1962, so it seemed less likely as a weird monster superhero book that probably as many people hung onto it as would have, Fantastic Four issues. But the interesting thing about this is it has fantastic color, but right up here, that's probably the bad angle to show it on. Let me do it this way. Right up here, look how clean that edge is, okay? Majority of these books have chipping, what's called Marvel chipping, along the side of them up here, okay? And those are generally those edges, and sometimes you'll see them up in the corners here. When they were bound with string and taken to the outlets, the convenience stores where they're sold on the spinner racks and things, they were bound with these ropes, and a lot of times the ropes, or the string, would dig into the side of the the books, and they would basically tear up the edges, and that's when you get this, what they call Marvel chipping. Now this book is only a 6.0, which is fine. I mean, that's a solid grade for a book this old, but you can't even find that many 6.0s that don't have chipping on it, and this one is clean. So this came up on Comic Link Auctions, which is a great site, by the way, and I was able to get this for less than what the normal sales price would be on this book for most sales. So I got a good deal on it, and I got a really clean, nice copy with no chipping on it. So that then is the second book that was on my hit list as a kid. First, it was at National 26, and the second one that I saw and just really wanted, but never thought I would own, would be an Incredible Hulk number 6, which now, thankfully, I do own. All right, that brings us to the third book. Now, this is a very significant book, as probably most of you, by looking at it, will realize. This is Avengers number 4, the first Silver Age appearance of Captain America. Now, probably all of us at some point saw a picture of this book and said, man, wouldn't it be cool to own that? The first Silver Age appearance of Captain America in the Avengers. It's one of the more significant Silver Age books in terms of first appearances or origin stories or whatever. It's up there. And this was a book that was always way out of my price range. It's one I saw as a kid, again, in these photo galleries in the price guide. But I was like, I was always been a big Captain America fan, and I was like, there's no way my income will ever catch up to the rate of value growth on this book that I'll ever be able to afford it. Well, even I just got this last year, 2 years ago at San Diego. And even then, it was on my hit list, sort of, but I was like, I'll never be able to afford that. I never bring myself to lay down the money to get that. Well, my son badgered me for, years, saying, quit buying these $40 and $50 books, save your money, like for the course of a year, and buy one big book. So I finally took his advice, and I started laying money aside. And when San Diego rolled around, I still didn't have enough, but with the money I made at San Diego, and kind of put me over the top. And I saw this at a dealer there, and I'm sorry, I can't remember the guy's name, but a decent sized dealer. Anyway, that's a 6.5. If you can see it, there you go. That's a 6.5, so that's a fine plus. It's a very solid grade for, again, a really expensive book. When you get up into 9.0s and 9.2s, this is a really expensive book. Right now, it's in this grade, it's probably sells for about $2,100 is about the average price that's going for. I got that for $17, and that was painful, boy, counting out the bills to buy this book. But I did it, and I'll tell you why. I met a guy probably 2 years ago. I'll give my son a plug here. He was working at Legacy Special Effects in Burbank. On a engineering internship, and we were down there on Hollywood Boulevard, and it was one of the few poster shops. It was still movie poster shops that were still left down there. And the guy that owned the poster shop, I went in there and was talking to him, and it turns out he has this amazing collection. And there's a book called Graven Images that has all these sort of monster and horror and sci-fi movie posters. And they're all from his collection. The Mummy, Frankenstein, Bride of Frankenstein, Phantom of the Opera, the silent version. He has an amazing collection. But he was telling me that back in the mid to late 70s, when he was just working as a teacher and wasn't making very much money at all. And anybody who's a teacher knows that's true. Well, one of the shops across the street from where he was at that time had in their window the Frankenstein movie poster from the original movie, right, from 1931. And they wanted $1,200 for it. And this is back in 76 or 77. He didn't have the money, but he said he went and borrowed the money from one of these loan shark type places with just ridiculous interest on it, right? And because he knew that if he didn't get it, he would regret it. And we all have those stories, right? How many times have we passed up on original artwork or comic books that we're like, oh, if only I bought that, it'd be worth a fortune now. Well, he sucked it up, borrowed the money, went and bought the poster, and then, worked his butt off to pay off that loan at the super high interest rates. Well, now that poster is worth almost $1 million. So it was painful at the time for him to lay down that money, I'm sure, but he did it, and now he's quite thankful he did. And that story was in the back of my mind when I saw this book, and I'm like, man, can I really count out $1,700 and buy this book? And I did. And now, like I said, now it's selling, a year and a half later, it's selling for 21. So I feel pretty good about it as an investment, but I also feel pretty good about the fact that I have the first Silver Age appearance of Captain America. And it's also an iconic Kirby cover. So there's a lot going on here that makes this a pretty special book to own. And again, this is number 3 on the 4 comic books that I never thought I would own, and now I do. All right, here we go. Number 4, and my most recent acquisition. In fact, it just showed up in the mail this morning. I've been waiting since I started this YouTube channel to do this episode of these 4 comics. I always was a original Captain Marvel fan. Even as a little kid, I always thought he was more interesting than Superman. Even though there really wasn't, there wasn't a Captain Marvel series in 1976. I think that the reboot that DC did in, I want to say 1971, I think it was over by then. So he didn't show up very often except in reprint material, or if you go to a comic book shop that had old comics, you might see an old Captain Marvel from the 40s once in a while. But I always just thought he was really cool. And of course, he had the television show in the 70s, which I watched as a kid. But the whole concept of a kid being able to say Shazam and turn into a superhero was a pretty cool concept, I think, and pretty attractive to young kids or young boys that dreamt of being superheroes, right? So anyway, there's like 3, in my opinion, there's 3 really good covers to Wiz Comics. Okay, there's the cover to issue number 1, the cover to issue 25, which those of you who don't know, you should look it up. Wiz Comics 25 has Captain Marvel leaning into a big turbine with sparks flying. It's a very iconic cover. It also boasts the first appearance of Captain Marvel Jr. on the inside. So it's a very significant book and a very expensive book, and one that I would love to have, but that dream may never be fulfilled. But this one, which I think is one of the top 3 covers, and arguably maybe the best cover of the Wiz Comics series, is what they call the impossible cover, because both Billy Batson and Shazam, or pardon me, Captain Marvel, are both on the cover at the same time, which of course is impossible because when Billy Batson says Shazam, he turns into Captain Marvel, so they couldn't actually coexist in the same place at the same time. That's getting a little deep into the comic book geek weeds, but there you have it. So that's why they call it the impossible cover. Now the story behind this is pretty amazing. One guy who's a dealer down in Florida bought up all the copies of these years ago, okay? And he had 50 some copies of it. Every time one came up for sale, he bought it. Every time one came up for auction, he bought it. And so for about, 20 years, you couldn't even get one of these books because he had them all. The reason he had them all was he had a sentimental attachment to this book and his grandmother. It's a long story, but it's a great story, but I won't tell it here. But anyway, so he had kind of a sentimental reason for buying all these books. He just wasn't being a jerk and buying all these books and keeping them off the market. They meant something to him personally. Well, recently, just this year, he started releasing these in the collector's market, and you can imagine how fast they were going. In fact, I didn't even know they were being sold until I went on the gpanalysis.com site, which is a great website for sales on, it reports sales on slabbed books and what they're currently going for and what the most recent sales and numbers were on them. So you can get a better idea of how much some of this stuff is actually going for at any given time in the market. Well, I saw a couple of them pop up and I was like, whoa, where did these come from? Well, I talked to my friends at Bedrock City Comics, Richard, Richard and Michael, excuse me, and they said, oh yeah, the guy that has all these, they know him personally, said that yeah, he's starting to release some of them, and I was like, what? And so I had Richard introduce me to him at San Diego this year, And most of the good ones were gone, as you can imagine. As soon as these hit the market, everybody was like, gimme, 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 gimme. And I was hoping to get a little higher grade, like an 8.0, although a 6.5, a Fine Plus, is still, in my opinion, a fantastic grade, especially for a Golden Age book. Anything past 1965, 66, I try and get 9.2s if I'm going to get a slab book. But anything earlier than that, I'm a lot more flexible because there's just not that many of them in really high grade. And like I said, a 6.5 is a really solid copy and a desirable copy. So I talked to him about it, and at San Diego, he told me the story and everything. And he said, well, I've got 2 coming back from CGC. Let's see what they're graded at. And they were already listed on the site. He just hadn't received them back yet. He had an 8.0, which is a VF book, and this 6.5. I thought, well, 8.0. For the money we were talking, I said, that's probably more than I want to spend on this book. But the 6.5, I thought, that'll probably fit into my price range. And sure enough, it did. He got it back, and we negotiated back and forth a little bit. But he kind of had me over the barrel, like he had anybody over the barrel. If you want one of these comics, you had to go through him to get it. And he was, he was fair, but he was charging what people were offering him for these books. So why would he, give it to me cheaper than he would someone else who's offering him more money for the book? Because there's some people that wanted these books because they're just not out there, well, until now. So I was able to secure this one at a 6.5, and I'm pretty excited that I did. Now the other interesting thing about this is, and I mentioned earlier that C.C. Beck drew the cover, who is really a terrific draftsman. One of the better guys in the Golden Age. The guy could really draw, and the figure work on this is just amazing. There's not a lot of line work and detail stuff, but just the solid figure work is just really, really nice. And that's one of the appealing things about it too. Is it's a 1942 book, sure, but it's so well drawn, and you don't expect to see that kind of draftsmanship, especially in a Golden Age book. That stuff came along later, in the 60s. With Steranko and Buscema and Kirby, of course, but guys that could really draw and were really great illustrators and draftsmen were like, and then Barry Smith and Wrightson and guys like that into the 70s, where comics, my dog's over there sneezing like crazy, so it's ruining my video or my audio probably, but so you didn't see this kind of draftsmanship back then very often. So that makes it a very desirable book. And the fact that it's just, like I said, one of the 3 best covers and super hard to find. And now I got one. So there you have it. Those are the 4 comic books that I now own that I thought I would never own. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button and subscribe to my channel. You can also hit the notification button to get alerts when I post a new video. Make sure you come back by soon so you can check out my next episode.